Welcome to the Burnout Recovery Podcast, a guiding resource dedicated to healthcare professionals on their journey to overcoming burnout. Spearheaded by Dr. Joe Braid, a certified professional coach and rehabilitation physician.
Hello and welcome back to the Burnout Recovery Podcast. Today I have another wonderful guest on the show, another colleague from Australia. In fact, Carlo Bellini and I met while I was on the Australian Clinical Entrepreneur Program, which was all those years back in 2022. Dr. Carlo Bellini, welcome to the Burnout Recovery Podcast.
Joe, it is so great to be with you and all of your listeners. I'm super excited to be here.
Thank you. So Carlo is an amazing human who wears many different hats and has had a really rich and varied career. And I'm not even going to start to explain some of that, Carlo. So can you share with my audience a bit about where it started, some of the journey, and now what you find yourself doing, please?
Absolutely. I'll start with the now, and then we can work a bit backwards. I'm an MD, a doctor, an executive and transformation coach, and work in leadership and empowerment. And really across those different areas, my main passion, my main focus, when I look at my work clinically and what most doctors do, a lot of it is unsicking the sick. My main clinical focus was cardiology, and I was always in working in cardiology more interested in the soul than the physical heart in many ways. I look at that and I think in all of my career, it's always been around empowerment. How can you be the best that you can be? I've always been fascinated and curious about human behavior. Seeing people that we see all the time in healthcare, where we give the advice, we give the science information, we give the education, and yet people make decisions and they act in certain ways that are against their own interest. And I think in science, we often think, and we get taught from a young age, people are rational. I saw in medicine, I saw in business, I saw in leadership, people, I believe, act to emotionally soothe themselves. They're not, the rationality is actually about emotional soothing. So I've founded and writing a book called The Emotional Blueprint, where I really explore a thesis and a pattern that I've seen, Joe, where I believe everyone, like we each have a fingerprint, a physical fingerprint. We each have a distinctive, unique emotional fingerprint that I call your emotional blueprint. So in my career, what really led me here is I always wanted to do medicine. It was clear for me, but I was one of those frustrated junior doctors that was like, why does the system operate like this? Why is the bureaucracy like this? Why are the inefficiencies there? And the answers of it's just the way it is felt just unacceptable to me. And I also didn't see leaders that I honestly felt inspired by. And this is about almost 20 years ago. So technology was not what it was now. We didn't have the different access to different things. But I was like, if I want to change the system and change it in healthcare, I felt my greatest power and impact was to go and learn from the best, not in healthcare, but in business, because I could see that who controls the money and who controls the policies very much defines the way the system operates. And my career from there was working in Silicon Valley in exponential technologies. It was consulting for the Boston Consulting Group globally. I became the youngest ever chief medical officer in a Fortune 500 globally when I was 29. So I got this accelerated path into these different worlds. And then I saw, wow, people are just people, no matter where they're going. You look at the healthcare leaders, you look at the business leaders, the people running multi-billion-dollar projects that I got access to as the executive physician. Everyone's got the same struggles. Everyone's got the same doubts. Everyone is a human trying to manage themselves in a bigger ecosystem. And I started seeing the patterns across all of that. And that's very much led me to building my coaching business that I have.
Wonderful. What a journey. I remember you saying at either a talk you gave or another time that you said, I wish I'd had that option to do medicine with a business degree rolled into one. So
yeah.
There must have been an early interest in business as well. Is that the case for you, Carlo?
That is very much the case. And there's an interesting story there. So I think what it was, I'm a Italian-Croatian first-generation migrant into Australia. And my parents are both pharmacists, which gave me exposure to healthcare. And they're community pharmacists, so small business owners, which gave me the access to business, like a lot of the migrant story of heading into business. So I got that from an early age, exposure and immersion of healthcare and business. And I actually, when I got into medicine, I went and asked the associate dean I want to do a combined medicine business degree. And I got laughed at because they were like, well, why would anyone do that? That's the most ridiculous thing. And the year later, they started a medicine arts offering, which I couldn't participate in because I was that year late, but business was still off the radar.
Yeah.
And now I did go and do my MBA at Oxford, after I'd graduated for a few years. And now I look at a lot of people come up to me and they tell me, Carlo, like, I wish I did that path. I wish I had followed it, because back then, 20 years ago, I got told by everyone that's the most ridiculous thing. And now we can see the obvious connection between leadership, medicine, healthcare, business. They're all interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it was influence from, I guess, the family pharmacy that you would have heard about, I guess, around dinner and stuff like that. That would have been very much talked about in your growing years, and then trying to push that boundary in your medical time. And it sounds like even if somebody was trying to do that 20 years later, it still might not be a go doing medicine and business just yet.
Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting in a business degree, you can teach the academics of business, but actual business is very different than what works in a textbook. And I noticed that. And it's also very different what we're talking about. If we're talking about a startup, we're talking about running a big organization. They're vastly different types of business. So it does depend on the segment that we're referring to. What I would say that I found that I think is universal is if you look at the way healthcare runs and healthcare systems run, especially in Australia, where we have government-funded systems, there's a lot of bureaucracy that almost hides the business. And if you look then in the bureaucracy, what I noted at a very early stage was if we underpin, well, what is this business? We can reframe it. Who's got the power to make decisions? And a lot of business is actually about key decision makers making certain decisions or not making certain decisions. So I could see, and we see it now in the if we call it the difference between clinicians and senior clinicians, often don't control budgets. If you don't control a budget, you have a lot less ability to influence the business. So I think there's a really interesting interplay between that. And that's really the path that I was like, I'm curious about this and I want to go and learn how to make great decisions and how to influence change in large systems. Because if we break down business, that's very much what it is.
Okay. So let's get into the organized questions. As someone who bridges healthcare, strategy and technology, what patterns of burnout have you observed across different healthcare roles as you've worked with clinicians through to executives?
I think the patterns that strike me the most regarding burnout are actually patterns of individuals' emotional nervous system wiring, what I would call your emotional blueprint, and how that intersects with triggers in the environment that people are working in. And the thing about in healthcare, depending on which environment we look at, they're often trigger-rich environments. And I think I see this with all my clients and me working in the system. I'm sure you would feel this, Joe. I think a lot of doctors are smart people working in dumb systems. And what I mean by a dumb system is a system that is technology naive, that things are hard to get done. I loved what your recent, you were talking about the pebble in the shoe and the stone in the shoe, and I've got nowhere to put my bag. And that's a frustration now. So if we look at a lot of healthcare systems, that they're innately dumb because they're organized around process and bureaucracy, less so about outcome. And when you put driven, smart people in that, you hit a friction point. And in these patterns, whether you're a clinician, whether you're an executive, the areas that, to me, activate the most burnout-inducing responses is when people are prone to the triggers, the environment provides the triggers, and essentially in that system, you have three responses. One is you just continue to get triggered. 2, is you remove yourself from the environment, or 3, you adapt your response to the triggers. And that's very much what I work with a lot of my clients around. So what we see is the triggers are going to stay, and getting triggered is a compound pathway to burnout.
Sure.
A lot of people say they want to shift and want to move environment, and I think it is either because they are fearful of taking a leap out. There's the security blanket of the comfort job in healthcare, and they can't see another option, or there might be that's the only center that they can work in. So you need a really adaptable way to rewire parts of your response. And that's what a lot of people struggle with. And the burnout pattern that I see is that, alongside working in a system environment job where what you really want and what that system is offering is misaligned.
Yeah. It's what we were just talking about off air, checking in with what do I really want? And that discussions around agency that I've seen you be a real leader in as well.
Yeah. And I'll share a couple of personal stories with this that I think are resonant. And I mentioned to you before that I've had 2 periods of my life where I feel that I was burnt, probably not fully burnt out, but on the path to burnout. And interestingly, each of them happened in quite different contexts. I mentioned to you, one was working obscene amounts of hours. I was consulting in Tokyo, and I was working for a Japanese client where the work practices are vastly different than Australia. And we were working, I don't know, maybe 100-hour weeks, something like that. I'd get called in back to the office at 1 a.m. to go finish slides till 3, 4 a.m. And then the other environment was when I was working in a Fortune 500 towards the end, where things were actually going great from a work capacity point of view. I was working not particularly many hours because I'd built systems, I'd built a great team and but the commonality between both those environments is it wasn't my desired place that I wanted to work. It wasn't really what I wanted. And I was internally misaligned with the external environment that I was in. And I was misaligned for different reasons. In Japan, I'm a very sociable person. I'm a very flexible person. In Japan, the environment penalizes people that are flexible, sociable. It wants structured and it wants reserved. That's who generally culturally gets rewarded. So I was a fish out of water over there. So I think if I look at that, I could never have thrived in that environment because I would have to sacrifice who I was as an individual. And the thing that I find most interesting is that is entirely predictable. I do psychometric assessments. I'm building my own in this space. And I look back at it. It was entirely predictable that Carlo doesn't fit in Japan working. Carlo fits more in Brazil, in Spain. It's those kind of environments. And then I look at the other environment, what it was an internal misalignment around my more personal career trajectory and path. And I'd reached a point where I wanted to progress. I wanted to go and build different things, but yet that means facing the fear and the discomfort of putting yourself out there, the vulnerability that it might not work. And you've got this safe, secure environment. And my burnout in that environment was the inattention between daily showing up, which actually was a daily surrender of the things I really wanted.
Yes, I see. Okay. Yeah. So good. Thanks for highlighting that and the real difference in contributors that you noticed in those 2 different scenarios. Really
different. And I see that with the people I work with. I see that with doctors.
Yep.
I've got a client that's recently started with me, super smart, super ambitious consultant. And the question is, how can I thrive and manage working in this frustrating system without losing my mind? And when you have that internal framing or disconnect between the environment that I desire to work in is not the environment, as I shared before, you have 3 options.
Yeah. 1,
you continually get triggered, compound path to frustration, overwhelm, burnout. Number 2, you change your environment. Number 3, you change you and your response, which is the agency piece.
Yes.
And in the work that I do with a lot of my clients, a cornerstone is agency. And for people not familiar with the term, I've described it as it's living your own life from the driver's seat of the car. You're driving the car. You're in control. And when we look at medicine and the culture and the hierarchy, we actually have systematized infantilization and surrender of agency from a young age. You're a medical student. There's year 1, there's year 2, there's year 3. You become an intern, you become a resident, you become a registrar, you go on a training prep. It's all laid out. You have a path. There's no decision rights. You can choose which one you take. But when you're in it, we're going to tell you when you can take leave. We're going to tell you these are the hours you work. You have to go do this rural rotation. Everything is this treadmill provided for you. And I think what most doctors are actually really good at, because we're often quite academically successful, we're really good when there's a path to follow and figuring out, oh, this is what you need to do in the path. You reach a point in your career where you've got much more options. You graduate as a student, you can choose where you work. You finish your training, you can choose what you focus in. And I find a lot of people then when they get in the white space of what do I do, they've never really operated in that for many years. And then they go and end up working in an environment that they're takers in the system. And the system, as I mentioned, is a dumb system. And that's where the tension really hits.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. I love that expansion on agency and when do we really have a lot of it in our roles, in our journeys in healthcare. And I also think there's like this business part that also comes in once you have moved further up the system and maybe you're trying to look more laterally and think, how can I make this system better? Or you're just exhausted from it. You're tired from the whole thing. And like you say, you just sort of don't go for change. It's easier not to rock the boat. It's easier to just keep showing up every day, although the sustainable part is a bit sketchy, I think, for the longer term.
And building on what you just said, I think there's a way that can be very productive, and there's a way that can feel immensely frustrating. And when you want to change a system, there's an element of, systems are hard to change. And a lot of the time you won't have the decision rights, and there'll be things that infuriate you. Though the people that I find navigate it most effectively, they have an ability to open up their emotional range and emotional fluidity. And what I precisely mean by that is the triggers will come in and you can feel them, but how you respond is more within your conscious decisions rather than your emotional autopilot.
Yep.
And the emotional fluidity is that the feelings can come and the feelings can go. Whereas what a lot of people that really struggle with it, it's almost that whole frustration of like, oh, I can't take it anymore. I don't want this. And that just never goes. And the worst case in many ways, the path to burnout after the initial frustration that compounds, a lot of people become apathetic. And I find that apathy extends into beyond their work.
Yes.
It's not just in the work sphere. So it has this flow on multiplier effect. And there are ways to respond that don't involve the apathy. But often to do that, it's learning to process feelings that generally you don't want to feel.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I talk about emotional fitness quite a lot. I like that term, emotional fluidity. And really overarching, we know that well-being is linked to having better emotional granularity, or a wider number of descriptor words for our feelings.
Yeah, and in my work, what I have seen, and I have ways of assessing people, is where their emotional blueprint lies. Because we'll see this. You'll see it with, let's just take two different people, for example, in the same work environment. One is immensely triggered, struggling, like so frustrated. Another, it flows off their back. So there is an element of innateness in terms of where you sit on that spectrum. And that's one thing that I don't think we really explore hardly anywhere. And that's one really large focus, is that I can, based on some assessments that I conduct and 15 minutes talking with you, I can assess your triggers, where you predictably will respond, often the magnitude of it, and I think what I find most interesting, the predictable consequences that will have later in your life.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And that's the part that I think is most interesting. So we can place people and we can know this environment will be triggering for you. So then there's an element about choosing the environment, having the awareness about where you sit, and then having knowledge and openness to understanding where you are and how to respond and change.
Yeah, so good. Wow, looking forward to your book, whenever that might be hitting the press.
Hopefully the end of this year, maybe early next.
So good. Yeah, really, really exciting. I'm curious about this zone. Your background includes being a practicing physician, a Boston Consulting Group alum, and now a healthcare transformation consultant. How have you maintained your own agency through these career transitions?
I think when I read your question, the answer I think lies in the question, which is the agency that I have harnessed is actually having the different career shifts.
Okay.
And if you look at that, at each time, I was pursuing curiosity, I was pursuing an interest, and I chose to shift and do that. So the agency, I think, is very much in I am the driver of my own car. When something wasn't, when I had either really grown and developed in a particular space. And I was like, I feel like there's less to learn, there's less to grow. I wanted to go and work globally. There was a whole variety of different things that the agency that I exerted in being the driver in my own car was I'm going to find, and the framework that I work with people, Joe, around what I call the achievement of high agency behaviors. It's the access. What's the goal? We want powerful possibilities. And how do we get powerful possibilities? Accelerator 1, seize opportunities. Accelerator 2, an action bias. And accelerator 3, create leverage. So this was about identifying the opportunities and then figuring out how to seize them, acting on it, not just thinking them through in my head and having it as continual dreams. And the third one, in the suite of actions and opportunities to access, how can I try and make them even more valuable with leverage? And when I'm being in there, be more efficient, productive, and all of these things then add up. 1 + 1 = 5. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Really like that. And that, makes sense. I mean, you're so self-aware. You were checking in. You knew you sort of had this sense of this peak that you'd risen to, or this zone that you're in, and that confidence to shift and move and do something completely different.
Yeah. And to share with your audience, it might look like this, wow, this trajectory is really impressive. And in some ways there are, but there's black spots on the journey, as I mentioned before, with the burnout. Another one that I'll share, what really prompted my resignation from my chief medical officer role. I'd been thinking about resigning for some time, and I'd built something I was very proud of. I'd learnt a lot, but I knew that the future wasn't there. I wanted to go and access different opportunities. And I had been procrastinating on that decision. And under the procrastination, and I see this with a lot of my clients, see with a lot of doctors, very cognitively smart people. And our cognition it results in the movement to overthinking as really emotional avoidance. And the overthinking for me was very much, what should I do? Where's I going to be? Am I going to be safe? But what it really was, I was just scared of leaving. And how did that activate for me to address it? Well, in 2016, I went on a road trip with my best friend from New York. We did Christmas in Perth, in Australia, where my family's from, New Year's Eve in Sydney, and then ended up in New Zealand a couple of days later. time zones, variety of different things, visited a hot springs on the way. We were doing a 9-hour drive from Christchurch to Queenstown, and 8 hours into the 9-hour drive, I fell asleep in the mountains and we rolled the car off the side of the mountain. And we should have died. We didn't. Fortunately, everything that needed to go right went perfectly right. And it was actually that moment that I thought, when you die, you either did stuff or you didn't do stuff. There was no, I'm thinking of, I should have, I could have. It's very binary. And I came home and that was an accelerator for me, that I could see that, and I could see the element of time, and I could see how I was procrastinating on this. And that was the impetus to shift through and face the emotional discomfort, because staying became more painful than leaving.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Significant life event.
Yeah. And we each have them. And what I find with so many people is, in the context of the absence of a significant life event, that fear can often remain, and we can overthink it. And we overthink it as a management strategy of it. And that's almost like the silent killer. Time goes on, and those paths often lead to burnout, where the emotions we don't want to feel, we find really sophisticated strategies of avoiding them.
Yes. With that cognitive load, I would say, and the energy that it takes to be avoiding them, to be parking them.
Absolutely. And then, I see that with a lot of people where, let's say you're in a particular work environment that you're frustrated by and you're dissatisfied with, and you struggle with boundaries, and you say yes to things you really want to say no to, because saying no feels so difficult. There's a price to be paid. It might not be in the workplace, but it might be in your home life. Sure. Where that burden of emotion has to be discharged somewhere. So we start to see all these different things that all come back to what I see is very much you're avoiding feelings that you don't want to feel. And from that, it has a lot of downstream effects.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay. I'd love you to expand a bit on your new coaching program, which is really tailored in this performance angle. And as someone who coaches healthcare leaders to become their best leader, I'm curious around what role does burnout prevention or burnout recovery play in leadership development? And are there any ways you address that in your programs?
The programs that I run one-on-one programs, group programs. And when I think about and I see the pattern in what most people want, most people will come and say, Carlo, I want to build my dream career, or I want a career transition. Or people say, I want to develop my leadership. And underlying all that, I see is, what's the emotional need that people have? And ultimately, I think for most, it's something around being proud of themselves, doing a great job, achieving a lot. And what I frame and the framework that I run, I call it either become your best leader, or for some people, Joe, it's become your hero. And for about half people, absolutely resonates to become your hero. And for other people, I think they don't necessarily see themselves as the hero in their own life. They see themselves more as the best leader. And I think if your life is a movie, it's like, which character are you? And for the vast majority of people, then they're not the extra that gets kicked out in the second minute of the movie. It's you're the main character. Yeah. And then it's very much, well, as the main character with main character energy, what would that character do in your position? And the program that I run, we work through a variety of different psychological assessments, the one-on-one work. It's all very intensive. And I think the special skill that I have is pattern recognition and identifying people's invisible emotional wirings that keep them stuck in the patterns that they have. And one of my clients described it as, Carla, you work with really capable but stuck people. And I see this in medicine where you work for most of your life and your behavior and your emotional wirings, they actually help you achieve. Then you reach a point where they're no longer helping you. They become a hindrance. So in that area, the biggest thing that comes around the burnout prevention and what you described there about how do you promote that in leadership, I find from an individual level, the first part that happens that with most clients of mine, I ask them, what do they want? And what I specifically call it, what are your shame-free wants? Because most wants are shame-filled. We learn it from a little kid. You learn it from growing up. It's like you tell your mom, hey, I want this. Oh, that's too big for you. You shouldn't have that. Oh, that dream's too wild. And we end up collecting a series of shame-filled wants. Whenever you have I should, when that is the start of the sentence, there's some element of a shame-filled want. Yeah. Because you should do something. And a lot of people can't really answer that very clearly. Some can say exactly what it is. So we start, what are your shame-free wants? And then the other part that we start with is most people's emotional range is capped because often to achieve your shame-free wants, you have to open up your emotional range. And I very specifically coined the term emotional range because it's the feelings that you don't want to feel that we have to actually address that often keeps you. So they're interconnected. And the people in the burnout prevention path, it's where we activate, open, and explore with curiosity and wonder what really are your shame-free wants and what's the range we're going to open up. Because that, I believe there's an enormous difference between fatigue and burnout. And I've been in those scenarios. I've worked crazy hours. We all have as clinicians. And I've worked crazy hours as a clinician when I absolutely was not burnt out because I really loved what I was doing, but I was fatigued.
Yes.
And then I've worked times where I was really not fatigued, but I was reasonably heading on a path to burnout because of there was a real disconnect between the shame-free wants and the emotional range that I had to address them.
Yeah, so got it.
That's the cornerstone of very much where I start with my clients. And then from a broader organizational point of view, there's a real element around relational intelligence and being able to understand how you relate to the organization, to the other people. And we talk about organization, we talk about companies like they're living entities. They're not, they're just a series of individuals. And most people, what I see, their emotional blueprint, their relational intelligence, and their ability to manage conflict are often at odds.
Yeah. Okay.
And a cornerstone of one area of work that we do, I call activating your deep authenticity. And in that, the shame-free wants, the relational intelligence, and the mastery of conflict. And then that links to your emotional awareness, your emotional regulation, and your emotional range. And when we can align those, and then you can see the skills of high agency and how to seize opportunities, have an action bias, and create leverage, burnout doesn't happen. Burnout doesn't happen because you're operating from an internal aligned system.
Yeah. Wow. It's fantastic. It sounds really good. And yeah, great strategies, great preventative approaches, which, sometimes some people discount that we can do burnout prevention and we can only do burnout recovery because it's inevitable. But I disagree. It's not in 100% of clinicians.
I'm with you. I 100% agree that it is entirely preventable. And it's not just a system element. There is an individual accountability there.
Yeah.
There are some people that their emotional blueprints mean that they have a much higher risk of burnout. Often that is the reluctance, the inability that feels so hard to have a difficult conversation, to put a boundary up. And then, as I mentioned before, the price has to be paid. You're either going to pay it in the discomfort of doing something you really don't want to do, or you're going to pay it internally.
Yeah. And
when you can open up and align yourself internally for what you really want, your shame-free wants, and you recognize that price of admission to do that is you're going to have to do things that are hard. That becomes an unlock for a lot of the people I work with.
Yeah.
And they see the patterns that they have not been doing that.
Yes.
And that once you see them, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. So good to hear. So with our final question, with your multidisciplinary background spanning medicine, business strategy, and AI, you clearly manage numerous professional demands. What is one self-care practice you rarely miss, even during your busiest periods?
If you ask me different times, I think I've got different things. One of the parts that I think is actually a bit hidden, but it's my ongoing pursuit of curiosity and learning. It's a real driver for me in my life, Jo. And I look at that and it's almost a bit of a happy place. And we each have a happy place in different things. But when I'm not learning, I just have this innate default to do something, to learn. And I look at that and it's a bit of a non, obvious and non-standard one.
Yeah.
That's often where I feel an element of progress and I feel an element of joy. Personally, I coach a lot of people. I built a health coaching institute where we trained thousands of people. And there's that element there where sometimes I find it's actually pretty hard as the practitioner, the practitioner and being the patient are often tricky. And a real focus that I've had in recent periods, last several years, I've done a lot of work with the United States. I've been traveling a lot there, time zones, on Zoom calls, and I could see how that was just not helping sleep. And I've made a conscious focus now in terms of I've put really strong boundaries and really, really trying hard to work on sleep, eating well, all those really basic things that we all know, but we often find it difficult. Sure. And I find like if I can combine that and a focus on it with the things that bring me joy, like joy is a really powerful driver. And paradoxically and counterintuitively, it's actually something that most people hold themselves back from and they're disconnected with their joy. And life, if you ask yourself the question in any task that you're doing, whether you really dislike the task, whether you really like the task, ask yourself, how could I feel 10% more joy doing this? How could I feel 20% more joy doing this? How could I feel twice the amount of joy doing this? Even for things you don't like, you will find ways to access it in yourself. And I think being able to connect with work that you're joyful in, and not only that you see the joy from a different perspective, that becomes a proactive burnout recovery technique.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Well, Carlo, we've covered so many different things. I'm really fascinated about your upcoming book, The Emotional Blueprint. Love some of your layouts and stepwise approaches to, growing agency and getting clear on really what we want in our precious lives that we have. What do you want to leave my audience with, as in details of where they can find you or how they can connect with you in this big wide world?
In terms of a reflection to take home, I'd ask people to consider the following. I think each of us are wired to want to feel certain feelings and not feel certain feelings. And they're more universal. So let's say, for example, Jo, you want to feel powerful. I want to feel powerful, right? But the strategies we use to either feel them or not feel them and avoid them can be quite different. So let's say for you to feel powerful, you might prop people up. And for me to feel powerful, I might bring people down. But we're both seeking the same thing. So I would leave as an inquiry for people, what are the feelings that you're most avoiding in your life? And what is perhaps the either visible or invisible price you're paying that you no longer want to pay? And in terms of finding me, you can find me on LinkedIn, Carlo Bellini. You can CarloBellini. You can email me, carlo@hip.consulting. You can just DM on any of the channels. You can find me around pretty easily. And if you're interested in coaching, whether that's one-on-one, whether that's group coaching, and it's really about unlocking your power, your potential, your performance, and doing that in a very, very aligned way, I would really love to hear from you. And any thoughts, anything that struck an insight, that struck a really resonant tone, please reach out. I always really love hearing from people that are going through things, and we can learn from each other.
Thanks for the reflection, Carlo. That was priceless. That was really good. And to my audience, I would encourage you, reach out to Carlo. He's an amazing human. And I've really enjoyed working with you and getting to know you through the Clinical Entrepreneur Program and beyond.
Absolutely, as have I, Jo. And thank you for all your work. It's been so great seeing it evolve, accelerate, and grow the last several years. So it's been a real pleasure to be with you here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Carlo. Talk soon. Thanks for listening to this episode. Schedule a 60-minute power hour with me and leave with relief, decisions made, and clear next steps. Or send me an email for a speaking inquiry. All information is available at drjobraid.com with links in the show notes.